live and breathe the gospel of Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, as we said, I hope that you all have a chance to take another look at that passage a little later and to compare it to the similar passage in John. We're going to be transitioning from the Gospel of Mark into the Gospel of John as we go toward the end of the summer. But today for our sermon, we're still in our sermon series. We're in week 3 of our series on the gospel in popular culture. Our first 2 weeks, I think, have been very enjoyable. We talked about the gospel in folk music 2 weeks ago. We talked about the gospel in literature last week, and we explored a few different genres in literature and the various truths that they attempt to reveal in the world. Right? Very much in the same way that our gospel written reveals truth in the world. Now, those truths ranged from difficult ones about society, revealed through satire, to critiques and portrayals of class dynamics and power structures, to the humanizing of tragic characters on the margins of society. All of these being things that Christ himself did through his gospel ministry. And we concluded last week, you may remember, by looking at one of the great characters in literature. We looked at Sherlock Holmes, and we noted that while he has been lifted up as a champion of deduction and the scientific method, he is also a figure who represents the pursuit of truth in the face of mystery. In every adventure, he undergoes a struggle similar to the spiritual struggle we all face in our lives, which is trying to discern absolute truths out of the mystery of life, creation, and death. Now, the work of Holmes, it demonstrates the awesome power of deduction, reason, critical thinking, but it also teaches us how to remain within mystery as people of faith, trusting in spiritual discernment to reveal gospel truths, in the world. So our next few weeks, we're going to dive a little more deeply into different genres of pop culture, including Hollywood movies, sci-fi, and comics. Again, you'll notice we've changed up our schedule a bit. We're going to now do musicals on August 12th. That should be a treat. We're going to enjoy some show tunes. We're going to hear a few different musical styles than the ones we normally hear on Sundays. But for today, we're looking at an extensive and deep and rich genre of popular culture. It covers different types of media, from books and movies to television and radio to even comics and video games. Today, we're looking at the gospel in fantasy. Now, since we can't possibly cover all there is to cover within this genre, we're going to focus today on 3 popular and beloved book series. We'll take a few minutes to look at each. So we have first the Chronicles of Narnia, and thank you to Tim for fixing these numbers. When I sent this to him, instead of 1, 2, 3, it said 1, 1, 1 for some reason. So it looked like they were all tied for first place in my favorites. Anyway, number 1 is the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. The second, we'll look at Harry Potter. And the third, we'll look at The Lord of the Rings from J.R.R. Tolkien. My other takeaway from this slide is that apparently you just have to abbreviate your first and middle names when you publish a fantasy title, and it'll become really successful. So never tell anyone your name, just use your initials, and you'll sell lots of books. Each of these has a lot of spiritual threads we could explore. We really could do a whole series on any one of these. Maybe someday we'll have time for that. But for today, we're going to look at a particular theme or thread for each of these. First, we'll speak about Narnia as a concrete and classic example of Christian allegory. Second, we'll look at Harry Potter as an exercise in the confrontation of death. And third, we're looking at Lord of the Rings as a portrayal of the sanctity of creation. So first, the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, I'm sure many of us are familiar with these books. We grew up with them or read them when we were younger. My mother's a big fan of these. Jess and I both enjoyed them when we were little. They follow the adventures of the Pevensey children, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, as they are relocated from London to the English countryside during World War II. While awaiting news of the war, they encounter a magical wardrobe which transports them to the land of Narnia. It's a place of tremendous beauty, inexhaustible magic, and it is free of human beings, but full of a variety of mythical creatures, all majestic and adorable. Now, the first book, we all know, is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Narnia in this book is under the control of the evil White Witch. She is awaiting the return, Narnia rather, is awaiting the return of the powerful ruler Aslan. He's an ancient lion. He oversaw the creation of Narnia. He is praised and revered by the Narnians. How many are familiar with these books? How many have read them? Okay, so it's just a little brief summary for those of us who may not remember or may not be familiar. So Aslan returns. A great power struggle ensues. And without giving away any major points, the children and the lion, they manage to team up to defeat the White Witch and liberate Narnia for a new age. Subsequent books in the series cover the children's return adventures and their growing and dying relationships with both Aslan and Narnia itself. Simply put, this is one of the best known and beloved Christian allegories out there. Aslan serves as a Christ-like figure, and Narnia serves as a metaphor for eternal life, or else for a faith-driven life here on earth. And the children's faiths are tested at every turn, and they're required to fight through challenges in order to be reunited with Aslan and serve and save Narnia time and time again. So Christian allegory, through this series at least, it has been present in the fantasy genre for quite a long time. But this one came out a long time ago, so maybe a more contemporary example of fantasy would be found in the Harry Potter series. J.K. Rowling's books, they're more of a contemporary myth for a younger and more modern audience. They take place in the modern world, and they follow Harry Potter, the boy who lived, as he grows up and discovers that there is very real magic in the world. How many have read Harry Potter? Just about all of us, I'm guessing. Okay. That magic is wielded by witches and wizards in an underground society with its own schools, its own nations, its own governments, and its own conflicts. One of the central themes of the series, and the theme that most binds and separates Harry and the story's villain, is the theme of how one copes with the reality of death. Now, Harry's relationship with the villain, the dark wizard named Voldemort, is defined by this theme. Harry, in the end, is a character who confronts the reality of death willingly and who ultimately greets death as an old friend. Meanwhile, Voldemort, that name, that is his taken name, which translated literally means flight of death, Voldemort spends his entire existence searching for ways to cheat that death. The hero humbly accepts this inevitability, while the villain fights to prevent it at every turn. And here I'm going to make another recommendation. This thread, this confrontation of death, is just one of dozens of gospel threads that are identified by Connie Neal in this book, The Gospel According to Harry Potter. We're going to draw from this series of books, The Gospel According to, quite a bit in the next few weeks. So if you're interested, please do take a look at some of these. There's one on Sherlock Holmes as well. It's called Holy Clues by Stephen Kendrick. And the third and final fantasy title for today goes along with the third book. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's one that we enjoyed very much during our first church movie night back on Friday. It's The Lord of the Rings. So I'm also going to recommend this book, The Gospel According to Tolkien by Ralph C. Wood. So the other night, during our movie night, we briefly noted that Wood's book is divided into several sections. The first is the Great Symphony of the Creation. It begins with the sanctity of creation, both creation in our world and the creation of Tolkien's world of Middle-earth. Second, the calamity of evil, how we deal with the reality of evil in the world and the marring of divine harmony. Marring here meaning to impair or to disfigure. Third is the counteraction to that evil, which is captured in Tolkien's vision of the moral life. How many have read Lord of the Rings, before I forget? A few? Fewer than the other ones, all right. After that, the lasting corrective, Tolkien's vision of the redeemed life. So a redeemed life following a moral life. And the final section is the consummation, when Middle-earth shall be unmarred or unimpaired or refigured. Middle-earth being the setting for this story in which evil is confronted. So these sections, you can almost see how they play backwards. It goes from the redemption of the world and the redemption of life within that world back toward the moral life that leads to that redemption. The moral life which rises from the reality of evil and the necessity to confront that evil which exists in spite of the sacred creation. So they lay out a thematic pattern that is centered around the sanctity and unity of creation. They establish creation, as in the Christian doctrine, as a divine act of beautiful willpower and love. Middle-earth is, in many ways, Tolkien's vision of a world just removed from paradise, just barely removed from paradise, and which is under threat by dark forces which must be vanquished in order to return that creation to its sacred state. And it is an archetype of the fantasy genre. It really defined everything that came after it. It was kind of the original popular work. And it features, like the other two titles, a wide array of magical and mythical creatures. So it draws from mythology, much like many of our religious texts and doctrines do. And it shares this with Harry Potter and Narnia. So Tolkien, now some of us know this, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who wrote Narnia, both shared a love of creation and nature and myth, as well as language. They were both professors of English, and they were good friends at Oxford University, where they taught. And those mutual experiences and shared writings, they had an impact on one another. We also mentioned this the other night. They were both heavily impacted by their service during World War I. And so they came to share a passion for fantasy writing, and they filled their works with the influences of their faith, from the sovereignty of creation to the presence of higher spiritual beings. So as an example in this one, in the case of Tolkien, these higher beings were the elves. The elves who came from across the sea, again, just removed from paradise, in order to oversee and protect Middle-earth. Now, the elves and their feuds with the men and the dwarves, they are also an exercise in the social gospel in Middle-earth, the gospel of diversity and the gospel of tolerance. That's a thread that we also see in the Chronicles of Narnia and in Harry Potter with the bigotry of so-called pure-blooded wizards. So like Lewis and Rowling, Tolkien's vision is a vision of unity, of peace and justice, and ultimately of divine love and grace. All of these must be delivered into a sacred world and into its environment while overcoming degrading industries of conquest and warfare, which again were influenced from their experiences in World War I. So, that was an overview of those three. Those are the three that we're looking at, and they each have many separate themes and smaller threads that you could pick up on. I really do recommend taking a look at those books, because even just by scanning the chapter titles, you'll see just how much there is to take from these stories. But for today, we have our three. We have Narnia as an example of Christian allegory, Harry Potter and the confrontation of the reality of death, and we have the Lord of the Rings as a portrayal of the sanctity of creation. All of these are deeply spiritual. All of them put their characters through profound faith journeys. And I failed to mention this during our announcements, but for those who are interested, we are going to begin our Sunday school class again after the service today. We're going to have, it's not going to be as much of a Bible study class as it will be a sort of free discussion about the ideas we've gotten into today. So I hope some of you will join us for that. So we're going to go into a little more depth in that discussion. And for now, we give thanks for these stories of fantasy which have been told, which mirror our own, and which reveal the loving and creative presence of God, not just in this world, but in all worlds. Thanks be to God, and amen.